So when they finally pulled the most dangerous man in Russia out from under the ice.
Right, the frozen ice of the Neva River.
Yeah, exactly. The Neva River in December of 1916. The autopsy actually revealed a terrifying truth.
And it wasn't what people thought, right?
No, not at all. It wasn't that he was a demon. It wasn't that he possessed, supernatural powers. The terrifying truth was that the myths were all completely wrong.
Yeah, every single one of them.
He hadn't drowned fighting for his life under the ice. He had been executed, like methodically executed, with a British-made bullet fired directly into the center of his forehead.
Which, I mean, it completely shatters the narrative we've all been sold.
Oh, absolutely.
Because for over a century, the story of Grigori Rasputin has been treated like a Gothic horror novel. You know, the quote-unquote mad monk who hypnotized a royal family.
Seduced an empire.
Right, and survived this barrage of poison, bullets, and freezing water. But when you actually look at the forensic and historical data...
The real data.
Yeah, the horror novel just evaporates, and what you are left with is an international espionage thriller, wrapped in the collapse of a 300-year-old dynasty.
Which is exactly what we are getting into today. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are undertaking a massive mission for you today.
We really are.
We are going to strip away the supernatural folklore. We're tossing out all the sensationalist rumors, and we are going to reconstruct the real medical, political, and, quite frankly, geopolitical realities of Rasputin's life.
And his incredibly violent death.
Right. And to do this, we've assembled just an absolute mountain of sources. We're looking at a declassified CIA literature review that details British intelligence operations in Imperial Russia.
Wow.
Yeah. Plus, we have the actual forensic autopsy evaluations of Rasputin's body. We're pulling from this really exhaustive academic paper out of Portland State University.
By Jesse Radcliffe, I believe.
Yes, exactly, which meticulously maps out the fragmentation of the Russian state.
And in addition to that, we also have archival reporting from The Guardian, some really deep historical analyses from the Smithsonian, and incredibly detailed Polish biographical records.
Right, on the guy who claimed to have assassinated him.
Exactly. And even an educational lesson plan designed to systematically dismantle the mythology surrounding the murder.
So, I mean, we have the tools to uncover the truth. But before we get to the British bullets and the basement of the Moika Palace, we need to understand the human being.
Yeah, the man himself.
Because if you want to understand how a system fails, you have to look at the anomaly that broke it. And Rasputin, he wasn't born a monster. He wasn't born an anomaly.
No, not at all. I mean, he was born in 1869 in Pokrovskoye, which is this tiny, super remote village in Siberia.
Which is, just imagine the isolation of that existence.
Right. It's a world governed by brutal winters, subsistence farming, and these deeply ingrained, centuries-old traditions. He was a peasant.
A normal guy, basically.
Pretty much. He married a woman named Praskovia, worked the land, had 3 surviving children, Maria, Dmitri, and Varvara.
Okay.
And he was known in his village as, a bit unruly, maybe prone to drinking and some petty theft in his youth. But otherwise, his trajectory was completely ordinary.
Until 1892, right?
Exactly. 1892 is the turning point. He leaves his family's farm and spends months at a monastery in Verkhodory.
So he just walks away from it all.
Yeah, and this sets him on the path of the starets, which is basically a wandering holy man, an elder, seeking spiritual enlightenment across this vast Russian landscape.
But he wasn't an official monk.
No, he wasn't ordained. He was a pilgrim. But this specific type of religious figure held immense cultural power in Russia at the time.
Why is that?
Well, they were seen as having a direct, uncorrupted line to God, like completely free from the bureaucracy of the official Orthodox Church.
Right, they were outside the system.
Exactly. And this transformation is what eventually placed him, in 1906, on a direct collision course with Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra.
So let's unpack the mechanics of that collision. Because on paper, it makes absolutely zero sense.
It really doesn't.
You have this wandering, uneducated peasant from Siberia crossing the threshold into the most highly guarded, gilded, exclusive rooms on the planet, the private nurseries of the Romanov dynasty.
Yeah, the contrast is wild.
It is. And to understand how he got that access and how he eventually leveraged it to pull the strings of the state, we really have to look at the deeply guarded tragedy of the royal family.
Because the Romanovs were hiding a desperate, terrifying secret.
Right.
Their youngest child, Alexei, who was the sole male heir to the Russian throne, suffered from hemophilia.
So let's break down the biology of that for a second. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder where the body basically lacks sufficient blood clotting proteins.
Right.
So if you or I get a cut, Our platelets stick together, they form a plug, and proteins like fibrin build a web to seal the wound. But in a hemophiliac, that fibrin web doesn't form correctly.
The bleeding just simply doesn't stop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the early 1900s, this was essentially a slow-moving death sentence.
Yeah. And it wasn't just about cuts from sharp objects. The real terror was internal bleeding.
Like bruises.
Yeah, a minor bump against a table or a scraped knee from tripping in the garden. Things that happen to literally every toddler.
Right.
That could trigger massive hemorrhaging into the child's joints and muscles. Alexei would suffer these excruciating, blinding pains as his joints just swelled with his own blood.
God, that sounds horrific.
He could easily bleed to death from a completely innocuous bruise.
And you can imagine the atmosphere in that palace. I mean, you are the autocratic rulers of a massive empire. You command millions of soldiers.
But you're powerless.
Utterly powerless to save your own child. Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandra were living in a state of perpetual, agonizing panic.
They brought in the most esteemed medical professionals in all of Europe. They tried traditional remedies. Nothing worked.
And the entire future of the Romanov line, the stability of the whole empire, rested on a boy who could die from a simple tumble.
And into this environment of absolute parental despair walks Grigori Rasputin.
In 1906.
Right, 1906. The Smithsonian source actually notes that he is introduced to the imperial couple and presents them with an icon of Saint Simeon.
Okay.
And Nicholas actually wrote in his diary that Rasputin made a remarkably strong impression. He captivated them in conversation for like an hour.
But his real hold on the family didn't come from conversation, did it?
No, it came from the undeniable physical results he produced when Alexei suffered his bleeding crises. Rasputin would be summoned to the nursery, and the boy's bleeding would stop.
Which, to Tsarina, was a literal, undeniable miracle from God.
Absolutely.
But, looking at our sources, they provide two incredibly grounded, non-magical scientific mechanisms for how Rasputin was actually treating the royal heir.
Right. And the first one involves a staggering historical irony regarding the state of medicine at the turn of the century.
Let's talk about the aspirin theory.
Yeah, so according to the Smithsonian source, the late 1890s and early 1900s saw the commercial introduction of a brand new, quote-unquote, wonder drug.
Synthesized by Bayer, right?
Yes, the Bayer company. It was hailed as this absolute medical breakthrough for pain relief and reducing inflammation.
Right.
And the royal physicians, naturally wanting to provide the absolute most cutting-edge premium care to the future Tsar of Russia, prescribed this wonder drug for Alexei's agonizing joint pain.
And that drug was aspirin.
It was aspirin.
So let's look at the pharmacology of aspirin, because this is where the tragedy just compounds. Aspirin works by inhibiting an enzyme pathway that produces prostaglandins, which cause pain and inflammation.
Okay.
But that same pathway also produces a lipid called thromboxane A2, which is essentially the chemical signal that tells blood platelets to stick together and form a clot.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. By giving Alexei aspirin, they were actively destroying whatever fragile, limited clotting ability his body still possessed.
So it's catastrophic.
Literally the worst thing they could do.
Right. Every time Alexei had a bleeding episode, the doctors would rush in, see a screaming child in agony, and administer more aspirin to manage the pain.
Making it worse.
They were inadvertently turning a localized bleed into a life-threatening hemorrhage.
And Rasputin, who is an uneducated peasant, obviously doesn't know the molecular biology of salicylates and chromboxane.
No, of course not.
So how does he solve it?
Through peasant skepticism, Rasputin possessed this deep, inherent distrust of modern aristocratic medicine.
Right.
So when he arrived at the palace during a crisis, his standard operating procedure was to tell the Tsarina to dismiss the doctors.
Just kick him out of the room.
Yeah, he would insist they stop bothering the boy, stop prodding him, and stop giving him their modern remedies.
So merely by banishing the doctors from the room, he was cutting off the supply of the anticoagulant.
Exactly. By stopping the aspirin, he allowed Alexei's body to naturally flush the drug out of its system. The boy's limited natural clotting factors could finally go to work, the bleeding would gradually slow down, and he would begin to recover.
And from the outside, it looks like magic.
Completely. The Tsar and Tsarina had just watched their son hovering at the brink of death under the supervision of Europe's top medical minds. Then, a Siberian mystic walks in, tells the doctors to leave, prays over the boy, and the boy lives.
It's the ultimate false correlation. It's kind of like a modern scenario where, a patient is suffering from severe side effects of an experimental, highly toxic medication.
Okay, yeah.
And an alternative wellness guru comes along, tells the patient to throw away the prescription and drink, I don't know, dandelion tea instead.
Right.
When the patient's body recovers from the toxicity of the medication, the guru gets credited with a miraculous cure.
Even though the tea did nothing.
Exactly. The tea did nothing, but the guru looks like a wizard because they halted the poisoning.
And that leads directly into the second physiological mechanism we found, which is the hypnosis theory.
Okay, let's hear this one.
So the educational materials from Storyboard that point to modern medical data, specifically studies highlighted by the University of Maryland Medical Center.
Right.
And they demonstrate that deep relaxation, guided imagery, and hypnosis can actually be highly effective adjunctive therapies for hemophilia patients.
Because they actively slow blood flow and reduce bleeding.
Yes.
We really need to explain the mechanics of that. Like, how does relaxing stop a bleed? It all comes down to the autonomic nervous system.
Right, so picture the chaotic environment of the imperial nursery before Rasputin's arrival.
It must have been insane.
You have a terrified, bleeding child in blinding pain. You have the Empress of Russia weeping hysterically. You have a team of panicked doctors hovering.
Right.
The child's sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response, is in overdrive. His heart rate is skyrocketing. His blood pressure is elevated.
And from a purely hydraulic perspective, higher blood pressure means blood is being pumped much faster out of those fragile, damaged vessels.
The panic is literally fueling the hemorrhage. Then Rasputin enters. He was a physically imposing man, known for this piercing, almost hypnotic gaze and a deep, resonant, remarkably calm voice.
Very authoritative.
Yeah. He would sit beside the bed, pray softly, and project this aura of absolute, unshakable certainty.
Which calms everyone down.
Exactly. He calmed the mother, which immediately lowered the ambient anxiety in the room. He spoke soothingly to the child, shifting Alexei's body from the sympathetic fight-or-flight state into the parasympathetic rest-and-digest state.
The heart rate drops. The blood pressure normalizes.
Furthermore, entering a state of deep, hypnotic relaxation causes slight vasoconstriction in the peripheral blood vessels.
The pipes narrow.
Right, the pressure drops and the flow of blood physically slows down, giving the body a chance to form whatever weak clot it can.
That is fascinating.
So between removing the aspirin and applying advanced, albeit intuitive, stress reduction techniques, Rasputin was providing genuinely effective medical intervention.
But the psychological fallout of this is just immense. You have a man who is actively saving the life of the heir to the throne.
Yeah, we cannot overstate the profound dependency this forged, particularly for Tsarina Alexandra.
Right, because she was desperate.
Exactly. To her, Rasputin was no longer a curiosity or a simple spiritual advisor. He was the literal, physical lifeline for her son.
He was everything.
The Smithsonian source actually highlights a chilling moment that shows Rasputin fully understood his leverage.
Oh, what did he say?
He once warned the Empress, stating explicitly, "The boy will live only as long as I am alive."
Wow. So he weaponized the illness. He essentially held the dynasty hostage.
Pretty much.
Because by saying that, he engineered a situation where he was entirely untouchable by anyone in the court, the church, or the government.
Right, because the Tsarina would shield him from any consequence. Allowing Rasputin to fall meant condemning her son to death.
And this untouchable status is the key. Because he was medically bulletproof in the eyes of the sovereign, his influence began to seep out from under the nursery door and into the corridors of state power.
Which forces us to examine the grand political narrative.
Yeah. How does one uneducated mystic manage to act as the catalyst for the collapse of a sprawling 300-year-old empire?
It's a huge question.
And I want to push back on the common scapegoat theory here. You don't just lose an empire because of a weird guy in the nursery.
No, of course not.
The system has to be vulnerable already.
And your intuition is spot on. The academic paper from Portland State University maps this out perfectly.
Okay.
Rasputin did not break the healthy, functioning empire. He drove a wedge into a structure that was already deeply fractured by trauma, gross inequality, and the autocracy's own broken promises.
So let's trace that timeline, because the stage was set for a disaster long before Rasputin had real power. We really have to look at the absolute nightmare that was the year 1905.
Oh, yeah. 1905 shattered the illusion of the Tsar's omnipotence.
How so?
First, you have the Russo-Japanese War. The Russian Empire expected to easily crush an emerging Asian power. Instead, the Russian Navy was essentially annihilated at the Battle of Tsushima. It was a humiliating, catastrophic defeat that destroyed the aura of Russian military invincibility.
And domestic unrest just explodes simultaneously with Bloody Sunday. in January 1905.
Right.
And the visuals of this event are just horrifying. You have thousands of freezing, starving, striking workers and their families marching peacefully toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg.
Completely unarmed?
Unarmed, they are led by a priest, Father Gapon. They are carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar. They aren't even trying to overthrow him.
No, they're bringing a petition.
Yeah, begging their quote-unquote little father for better working conditions in an 8-hour workday.
And the Imperial Guard opens fire on the unarmed crowd. Hundreds are killed or wounded.
It's brutal.
The blood on the snow that day fundamentally broke the spiritual bond between the Russian peasantry and the Tsar. It triggered nationwide paralyzing strikes. The entire country was engulfed in the 1905 revolution.
And to survive, Nicholas is forced to issue the October Manifesto, which promises massive democratic reforms, freedom of speech, and the creation of the Duma, a national elected parliament.
But the PDX Scholar paper emphasizes that Nicholas never intended to share power.
Right, he was an autocrat.
He believed absolutely in his divine right to rule. Before the First Duma even convened in 1906, he issued the fundamental laws retaining absolute veto power over any legislation.
Wow.
And keeping sole control of the military, foreign policy, and the appointment of ministers. When the First Duma proved too independent, he just dissolved it after 72 days.
He essentially rewrote the rules of the game whenever he started losing.
Pretty much. By the time of the Third Duma in 1907, his prime minister, Pyotr Stolypin, orchestrated a massive alteration of the electoral laws.
To rig it.
Yeah, the voting system was gerrymandered to heavily favor the wealthy elite. The mathematics of the disenfranchisement are actually staggering.
What were the numbers?
The vote of one wealthy landowner was equal to the votes of roughly 540 peasants or industrial workers.
That is insane.
So he created a compliant, rubber-stamp parliament of aristocrats.
Okay, so the foundation of the empire is cracking. The peasantry feels betrayed by the sham of democracy. The industrial workers are radicalizing. The military is humiliated.
It's a powder keg.
I want to offer an analogy here. Think of Imperial Russia in the 1910s as a massive, deeply malfunctioning circuit board. Sparks are flying, wires are frayed. The central processor, the Tsar, is outdated and failing.
I like that.
Right. Rasputin didn't generate the electricity. He didn't create the anger or the poverty. But Rasputin was a highly conductive, exposed wire dropped right into the middle of that board.
Yeah.
He channeled all those existing sparks directly to the central processor, causing the entire system to short out.
That is an incredibly accurate metaphor for how the PDX Scholar paper describes his impact.
Really?
Yeah, and to see exactly how that conductive wire short-circuited the system, the paper references a 1668 painting by Simeon Ushakov called The Tree of the Muscovite State.
Okay, visualizing this helps tremendously. Paint the picture for us.
Imagine a massive tree growing out of the Assumption Cathedral in Moscow. On the left branches, you see the political rulers, the czars and princes.
Okay.
On the right branches, you see the spiritual leaders, monastic saints, metropolitans, and patriarchs.
So they're literally on the same tree.
Exactly. This wasn't just art, it was the constitutional reality of Russia. The church and the state were inextricably, physically intertwined. They grew from the same trunk.
Right.
The Tsar ruled by divine right, and he controlled the church bureaucracy through a governing body called the Holy Synod.
Meaning, an infection in one branch automatically rots the other. If the church loses its moral authority, the Tsar loses his divine justification to rule.
And Rasputin was the ultimate pathogen.
Let's look at the church branch first, then.
Okay, so Rasputin's power stemmed from his image as a holy ascetic, a man who had conquered sin. But the reality was a public spectacle of debauchery.
Right.
He was frequently aggressively drunk in public. He engaged in highly publicized affairs with aristocratic women.
Right. Rumors connecting him to the Khlusti sect, right?
Yes, an underground sect that allegedly practiced ecstatic, flagellant rituals.
What does that mean?
Well, they believed they could drive out sin by sinning specifically through erotic communal rituals.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Whether he was officially a member or not, his behavior mirrored the rumors. His own wife, Praskovia, when confronted with his infidelity, famously shrugged it off, saying, "He has enough for all."
It's astonishing that he maintained any religious credibility. Like, how did the actual Orthodox hierarchy respond to this?
With absolute horror. Prominent, deeply respected religious figures tried to excise the rot.
Have it up so.
The PDX Scholar paper details the actions of Bishop Hermogen, a powerful conservative figure. Hermogen initially supported Rasputin, but eventually realized he was a fraud.
Okay.
Hermogen actually physically confronted him, striking him with a cross, and declared that Rasputin cast a slur on the empress with his quote-unquote unclean hands.
Wow.
And another prominent monk, Iliador, publicly denounced him, stating that Rasputin never prayed and only pursued women.
And how does the Tsar, the defender of the faith, handle his top bishops calling out a charlatan?
He exiles the bishops.
I'm kidding.
Nicholas, driven entirely by Alexandra's terrified demands to protect her son's savior, ordered Bishop Hermogen stripped of his diocese and banished to a monastery.
Wow.
Iliador was driven into exile. Nicholas actively silenced the most respected voices in the church to protect Rasputin.
That is a fatal error. The conservative religious base was the bedrock of the Tsar's support. By siding with a scandalous peasant over his own bishops, Nicholas alienated the very people who believed in his divine right.
Exactly.
So the church branch is rotting. What happens when that infection crosses over to the state branch?
Paralysis and intense factionalism.
Okay.
The president of the Duma, Mikhail Rodzianko, documented this extensively. The entire upper echelon of the Russian government split into two camps.
Which were?
Those who sought to destroy Rasputin to save the monarchy, and those who realized that flattering Rasputin was the only way to get promoted by the Tsarina.
The ultimate sycophancy. Ambitious politicians recognized that the path to power didn't go through the Duma. It went through the nursery.
Precisely. Men of incredibly low competence, like Boris Sturmer, were elevated to prime minister simply because they allied themselves with Rasputin.
That is a recipe for disaster.
Meanwhile, fiercely loyal generals and ministers begged the Tsar to send Rasputin back to Siberia, warning him that the prestige of the crown was evaporating.
And Nicholas ignores them too.
Yeah.
But the tipping point, the moment where the exposed wire finally blows the circuit board, is the outbreak of World War I.
Yeah. The Great War magnified every existing flaw in the Russian state by a factor of 10.
How bad was it?
Millions of Russian soldiers were being sent to the front lines without adequate rifles, boots, or ammunition. The casualty rates were apocalyptic.
Horrific.
And in 1915, Nicholas makes the single most disastrous political decision of his reign. He leaves St. Petersburg to personally take command of the army at the front lines.
Leaving Tsarina Alexandra in charge of the domestic government.
Yes, Alexandra, a woman of German descent during a war against Germany,
Right.
who is deeply unpopular, highly paranoid, and entirely dependent on Grigori Rasputin.
Just think about the optics of this for the Russian public. You are a starving worker in Petrograd. Your son is dying in a trench in Poland. And the government is effectively being run by a German woman who is firing competent ministers and replacing them with whoever a drunken, illiterate peasant tells her to hire.
The censorship apparatus entirely collapsed.
I bet.
The PDX Scholar paper describes how underground pamphlets and political cartoons just flooded the streets. The most famous cartoon depicted Rasputin as a massive, grinning puppet master.
Oh, I think I've seen that one.
Yeah, and in his hands, dangling by strings, were tiny, helpless caricatures of the Tsar and Tsarina.
He became the undeniable visual proof to every class of Russian society that the autocracy was diseased. The peasants hated the aristocrats hated the royal couple, and everyone hated Rasputin.
Yeah?
He united the fragmented empire, but he united them in rage against the throne.
Yeah. Which brings us to the breaking point. The elite defenders of the empire, the aristocrats, the conservative politicians, the extended royal family, they realize the Tsar is never going to wake up.
Right.
They decide that to save the monarchy from an impending revolution, they have to amputate the infected limb. They have to kill Rasputin.
Enter Prince Felix Yusupov.
Yes.
Now, if you were pitching this story to a studio, they would tell you Felix Yusupov is too cartoonish to be real.
Seriously.
The Polish Wikipedia biographical records paint a portrait of a man whose privilege is almost impossible to comprehend today.
The Yusupov family fortune dwarfed the wealth of the Romanovs.
Dwarfed the Tsar.
Yes. We are talking about unimaginable generational wealth. Felix was the sole heir to 4 palatial estates in St. Petersburg, 3 in Moscow, and 37 massive estates scattered across the empire.
It's absurd.
He owned coal mines, iron ore operations, oil fields on the Caspian Sea, factories, and just endless tracts of land.
And he's the sole heir because his older brother, Nikolai, was killed in a duel.
Right. Yes, Nikolai was killed in a duel with Count Arvid Manteuffel over an affair.
Of course.
So Felix, who had a reputation for cross-dressing in high society clubs and living a life of extreme decadence, suddenly inherits everything.
Natural.
He attends Oxford University between 1909 and 1913, where he joins the Bullingdon Club, a notorious, ultra-exclusive dining society known for spectacular wealth and destructive behavior.
Right.
And to cement his status at the absolute apex of the Russian pyramid, in 1914, he marries Princess Irina Romanova, the Tsar's own niece.
He is the ultimate insider. He is the physical embodiment of the Russian aristocracy. And as he watches Rasputin drag the aristocracy's reputation through the mud, he decides to act.
Yeah.
So he recruits a right-wing Duma politician, Vladimir Purishkevich, and the Tsar's cousin, Grand Duke Dmitry.
Yeah.
And on the night of December 16, 1916, they lure Rasputin to the basement of the Yusupov's Moika Palace.
And this is where the myth is born. The legend that has defined Rasputin for 100 years.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Well, I want to lay out what Yusupov claimed happened in his 1928 memoir, and then we will look at the forensics and dismantle it piece by piece.
Let's hear the superhero origin story first. What did Yusupov claim?
According to Yusupov's narrative, he lured Rasputin to the Moika Palace under the pretense that Rasputin would finally meet Yusupov's beautiful wife, Irina.
Okay.
In reality, Irina was in the Crimea. Yusupov brings Rasputin into the newly renovated basement, which has been set up like a dining room. He serves Rasputin tea, heavily frosted petit fours, and sweet Madeira wine.
And this is the famous part.
Crucially, Yusupov claims the cakes and the wine were laced with enough potassium cyanide to kill several men.
And according to the memoir, Rasputin eats the cakes, drains the wine glasses, and just sits there.
Yusupov writes that he sat there in absolute terror as Rasputin showed zero effects of the poison, even asking for more wine.
Unbelievable.
Believing he is dealing with a demonic entity, Yusupov makes an excuse to go upstairs, grabs a revolver from Grand Duke Dmitry, returns to the basement, and shoots Rasputin squarely in the chest. Rasputin collapses onto the floor, bleeding out.
But the monster refuses to die.
Yusupov claims he leans over the body to check the pulse. Suddenly, Rasputin's eyes snap open. He leaps to his feet, foaming at the mouth, attacks Yusupov, tears an epaulet off his uniform, and scrambles up the stairs and out into the snowy courtyard.
That's like a movie.
The assassins, in total panic, chase him into the night. Purishkevich fires several more shots, hitting him in the back. They drag his body back inside, beat him savagely with a rubber club, bind his hands and feet, drive him to the bridge, and throw him through a hole in the ice into the freezing Malaya Neva River.
And the crowning jewel of this myth, the detail everyone repeats, is that when the police pulled his frozen corpse from the river days later, his hands were supposedly untied and his lungs were full of water.
Right.
Proving he had survived the poison, the bullets, and the beating, and had died desperately trying to claw his way out from under the ice.
It is an incredible, theatrical, terrifying story. And from a forensic standpoint, almost none of it is true.
Okay, let's take the forensic hammer to this legend, starting with the poison.
Right.
Why didn't the potassium cyanide kill him? Was it a miracle? Was he immune?
The educational materials from Storyboard that, corroborated by basic organic chemistry, provide a fascinating and entirely scientific explanation.
Widget.
The assassins were incredibly wealthy, but they were deeply incompetent amateurs when it came to chemistry. When you look at the molecular structure of glucose sugar, it contains an aldehyde group. Potassium cyanide has a very high chemical affinity for aldehyde groups.
Wait, I see where this is going. If you mix cyanide with sugar...
When you combine potassium cyanide with heavy amounts of glucose, they react to form a compound called cyanohydrin.
Oh, wow.
Cyanohydrin is vastly less toxic, effectively neutralizing the lethal effects of the cyanide.
That's hilarious.
By mixing the poison into heavily frosted, sugary cakes and sweet, syrupy Madeira wine, the assassins initiated a chemical reaction that neutralized the poison before Rasputin even put it in his mouth.
That is genuinely absurd.
Yeah.
But why wouldn't an Oxford-educated aristocrat know that?
Because chemical interactions of poisons weren't exactly on the Bullingdon Club syllabus.
Fair enough.
They were aristocratic party boys playing at being assassins. And there is a second layer to the poison myth.
Oh.
The Smithsonian source highlights testimony from Rasputin's own daughter, Maria, who wrote a book vehemently criticizing Yusupov. She pointed out a glaring flaw in the narrative.
Oh, is it?
Her father suffered from hyperacidity and actively despised sweet foods. He never ate pastries. He would not have touched a platter of sweet petit fours.
So he likely only drank the wine, which had already neutralized the cyanide, rendering the whole poisoning attempt a complete farce.
Exactly.
So the poison is a botched amateur hour.
Okay.
But what about the terrifying climax, the struggle under the ice?
A complete fabrication. The actual historical autopsy was performed by Professor Dmitry Kosaratov, a highly respected forensic pathologist. The records of this autopsy give us the undeniable truth.
Okay.
When Kosaratov examined Rasputin's lungs, he performed the standard tests to check for drowning.
And what did he find?
0 water. There was no water in the lungs. Furthermore, the supposed water found in his stomach was minimal and consistent with the fluids a person would naturally have after drinking. The medical conclusion was definitive.
He wasn't breathing.
Rasputin was not breathing when he was thrown into the river.
He was dead before he hit the ice. There was no struggle, no demonic resilience.
Exactly. He was a human being who succumbed to massive internal trauma and blood loss from gunshot wounds.
So let's deduce the PR spin here.
Yeah.
If Yusupov completely botched the poisoning through sheer chemical ignorance and then panicked, shot an unarmed man in the back, beat his corpse, and dumped him in a river,
Yeah.
why invent the superhero narrative? Why tell a story in 1928 that highlights your own repeated failures to kill him?
Because you have to put yourself in the psychological position of an exiled aristocrat.
Okay.
If the public accepts the cold forensic truth that a group of incredibly wealthy, privileged men lured a defenseless, unsuspecting peasant into a basement, failed to poison him out of sheer incompetence, shot him in a panic, and bludgeoned his corpse.
Then Felix Yusupov is nothing more than a cowardly, thuggish murderer.
He becomes the villain who murdered a commoner.
Right.
But if you control the narrative, if you write a memoir claiming that Rasputin wasn't just a man, but a supernatural behemoth, a dark wizard who eats cyanide and shrugs off bullets to the heart,
Well, then killing him requires a hero.
by elevating Rasputin to the status of an unkillable monster, Yusupov elevates himself to the status of a legendary dragon slayer.
That is brilliant.
He transforms himself from a cowardly assassin into the mythical savior of Mother Russia, who had to employ extreme measures to defeat a demonic threat.
That is an astonishing piece of historical manipulation. He weaponized a horror story to save his own reputation.
He really did.
And the Polish Wikipedia entry outlines how incredibly lucrative that manipulation became. Yusupov survived the Bolshevik Revolution. He fled Russia aboard the British battleship HMS Marlborough and settled into a life of exile in Paris.
And he aggressively protected his copyright on the murder.
He essentially monetized the assassination, didn't he?
He did. The most famous example is his lawsuit against Hollywood. In 1932, MGM released a major motion picture called Rasputin and the Empresses.
Right.
The film featured a character clearly based on Yusupov's wife, Princess Irina, and heavily implied that she had been seduced by or had an affair with Rasputin.
Which is factually absurd because Irina wasn't even in St. Petersburg at the time and had never met him.
Right. So Yusupov and Irina sue MGM in an English court for libel and invasion of privacy, and they win an enormous victory.
How much?
In 1934, the court awarded them a massive payout of £25,000, which is the equivalent of well over £2 million today.
Yeah.
And this lawsuit is actually the reason why, to this day, every movie and television show carries that standard disclaimer.
Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental one.
Exactly. The all persons fictitious disclaimer exists because Felix Yusupov successfully sued a studio over the myth of Rasputin.
That is wild.
He banked on the legend, and he lived out his days in relative luxury, granting interviews up until his death in 1967, still proudly claiming credit for saving Russia.
But while Yusupov spent 50 years basking in the spotlight, the forensic evidence points toward a much darker, much more complex reality operating in the shadows.
This is where we shift.
Yeah, we shift from a domestic aristocratic murder to a massive geopolitical conspiracy. We have to talk about the British bullet.
The CIA Literature Review.
Right. The declassified CIA literature review of Giles Milton's book, Russian Roulette, and the historical reporting from the Grunge bring us back to Professor Kosaratov's autopsy.
Okay.
We know the autopsy proved Rasputin didn't drown. But what else did the physical evidence reveal about the shooting itself?
Kosaratov documented 3 distinct bullet wounds. There was a shot to the chest and a shot to the back, which aligned with the stories of Yusupov and Purishkevich.
Okay.
But crucially, the 3 bullets were fired from 3 different weapons of different calibers.
Meaning there were at least 3 shooters.
Exactly.
And the fatal shot, the one that actually ended his life.
The fatal shot was a contact wound, perfectly placed directly in the center of Rasputin's forehead. It was an execution-style coup de grace.
Right.
And modern forensic analysis of the autopsy photos and reports strongly indicates that this specific, unjacketed lead bullet was fired from a .455 Webley revolver.
The standard issue sidearm for British military officers and intelligence agents.
Yep.
So we have a British bullet in the brain of a Russian power broker, fired in the basement of an imperial palace in 1916. How does a British gun get into that room?
Enter a man named Oswald Rayner.
Who is he?
Rayner was an active agent for the British Secret Intelligence Service, the organization that would later become MI6. He was officially stationed in Petrograd. Okay? And the connection that ties this entire theory together. Oswald Rayner was close, personal friends with Prince Felix Yusupov.
No way.
Yes, they had studied together at Oxford University. They ran in the same circles.
The CIA review notes that Rayner was reportedly present at the Moika Palace on the night of the assassination.
He was there.
So we have an MI6 agent at the scene of the crime, and the fatal shot matches his service weapon. The obvious question is why? Let's connect this to the macro level.
The geopolitical motive.
Right. Why would the British government, in the middle of fighting the largest war in human history, care about a scandalous mystic advising the Tsarina? What is the motive?
The motive is absolute existential terror.
Okay.
By December 1916, World War I had become an apocalyptic meat grinder. The battles of the Somme and Verdun had resulted in millions of casualties.
It's brutal.
The British and French forces are bogged down in the horrific trench warfare of the Western Front. The survival of the British Empire depends entirely on the Russian army keeping the pressure on Germany from the east.
Because the Eastern Front forces Germany to fight a two-front war, splitting their resources.
Exactly. If Russia collapses or quits the war, the German High Command takes 50 divisions of battle-hardened troops from the east, puts them on trains, and unleashes them on the Western Front.
It would have overwhelmed the Allied lines. Paris would fall, London would be threatened. It was the nightmare scenario for British intelligence.
And terrifying intelligence reports were flooding into London from Petrograd.
Reports about Rasputin.
Yes. Rasputin was historically anti-war, he was a peasant, and he knew that the peasantry bore the brunt of the suffering and the dying in the trenches. He had actively advised the Tsar against going to war in 1914. By 1916, the rumors in the capital were that Rasputin was leveraging his immense influence over Tsarina Alexandra, who, remember, was born a German princess.
Right, which didn't help her popularity.
Not at all. He was allegedly pushing her to sign a separate secret peace treaty with Kaiser Wilhelm.
Was there any actual proof he was doing that?
Modern historians generally conclude that the rumors of a secret peace treaty were heavily exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated by his political enemies.
Just to smear him.
But in the paranoid, high-stakes, fog-of-war environment of 1916, perception is reality. The British government firmly believed Rasputin was a catastrophic threat to global security. They believed he had the Tsarina's ear, and the Tsarina had the power to pull Russia out of the war.
So British intelligence decides that the survival of the Allied forces requires the surgical removal of a single mystic in Petrograd.
Yeah.
An MI6 agent utilizes his Oxford buddy, an aristocratic prince, to gain access to a highly secure target. And when the amateurs fail to poison him...
Because of the sugar.
Right. The professional operative steps in and puts a single, precise bullet into the target's forehead.
It is the literal prologue to a James Bond film.
It really is.
And the CIA literature review of Russian roulette paints a vivid picture of just how aggressive and audacious British intelligence operations were in Russia at this time.
Oh, yeah.
MI6 was being run by its founding director, Mansfield Smith Cumming. He was this eccentric, wooden-legged commander who famously signed his documents with a green C.
Establishing a tradition that continues to this day.
Exactly. The review details incredible tradecraft. Cumming assembled a network of spies in Petrograd and Moscow, including legendary figures like Sidney Riley.
Wow.
They were using multiple forged identities, operating strings of safe houses, and carrying out daring exfiltrations via motorboat under the noses of the secret police.
That's intense.
They even authorized the deployment of chemical weapons, specifically arsenic-based M devices, to support anti-Bolshevik forces later on.
So this was a ruthless, highly active, State-sponsored intelligence network operating in the chaotic shadows of a collapsing empire.
Very much so.
Executing a single advisor who was perceived as a direct threat to the British war effort was absolutely within their operational parameters. If the amateurs botched it, Rayner was there to finish the job and ensure the target was eliminated.
It completely reframes the narrative for you. The assassination wasn't just a domestic aristocratic squabble over honor. It was a targeted international black op.
But assuming this theory is the reality, let's look at the incredible historical irony of the outcome.
Okay.
If British intelligence orchestrated or finalized the murder of Rasputin to stabilize the Russian government and keep them fighting the Germans,
It was a spectacular miscalculation.
it was an absolute disaster of unintended consequences. The architects of the murder, whether British or Russian, fundamentally misunderstood the situation.
Completely.
They thought removing Rasputin would cure the sickness rotting the Russian government. They failed to realize that Rasputin wasn't the disease. He was merely the most visible symptom of a terminal systemic failure.
Right, removing the conductive wire doesn't fix a shattered circuit board.
Exactly. So how did the Russian public react to the assassination? Did the Tsar suddenly regain his popularity?
Quite the opposite. The Smithsonian source summarizes the fallout beautifully. The Russian elite, the aristocracy, the Yusupovs of the empire, they rejoiced.
They thought they fixed it.
They thought they had saved Russia. But the peasantry mourned.
Why? I mean, he was a scandalous drunk who ruined the government.
Because to the vast majority of the Russian population, the millions of peasants starving in the villages and dying in the trenches, Rasputin wasn't a demon.
He was one of them.
He was. He was a fellow peasant who had miraculously breached the impenetrable walls of the autocracy. He had made it into the halls of power. He had the ear of the Tsar. And what happened to him?
The wealthy, privileged aristocrats slaughtered him like a dog.
Think about the psychological impact of that. It proved the peasants' deepest, darkest, most cynical belief about their society.
That the system was fundamentally rigged.
And that the rich elite would murder any commoner who dared to step out of their assigned place in the hierarchy.
Wow.
Exactly. The murder of Rasputin did not prevent the revolution. It accelerated it. It stripped away the last remaining illusions that the Tsar could bridge the gap between the classes.
The timing is crazy, too.
Barely 2 months after his body was pulled from the Neva River, in February 1917, the revolution exploded in Petrograd.
Right.
The workers went on massive strikes. Crucially, the military garrisons mutinied and refused to fire on the crowds. Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate.
Ending 300 uninterrupted years of the Romanov dynasty in a matter of days.
Yes. A provisional government took over, but they fatally chose to remain in World War I.
Which is a huge mistake.
Huge. This continued unpopularity allowed the Bolsheviks, under Vladimir Lenin, to seize power in the October Revolution later that year, and what was one of the very first major policy decisions the Bolsheviks made.
They signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They pulled Russia out of World War I.
Precisely. The exact geopolitical nightmare scenario that British intelligence was trying to prevent by putting a bullet in Rasputin's head happened anyway.
That is just incredible.
And arguably, it happened faster because of the massive instability his assassination triggered. And the tragedy culminated a year later, in 1918, when the entire Romanov family, Nicholas, Alexandra, and the children, including young Alexei, were brutally executed by Bolshevik guards in a basement in Yekaterinburg.
The fallout is staggering. So let's step back and survey what we've uncovered today. We have stripped away the disco songs and the movie monsters.
Yeah.
We explored the deeply human, tragic medical reality of a desperate mother relying on a peasant who inadvertently figured out how to stop the catastrophic effects of early pharmacology.
Eat aspirin.
Right. We mapped out how that reliance created a fatal vulnerability in a political structure that was already crumbling under the weight of its own inequality and autocratic hubris.
Since the 1905 revolution, the Duma, all of it.
And finally, we uncovered the forensic reality of a botched aristocratic murder masked by a likely British intelligence operation, which was then spun into a supernatural myth by an assassin desperate to protect his own legacy.
And if we pull back to the macro level, it leaves us with an incredibly profound realization about the mechanics of history itself.
What's that?
We are often told that history is written by the victors, but the legacy of Grigori Rasputin proves that sometimes history is quite literally written by the murderers.
Felix Yusupov got to dictate the narrative for 50 years because he was the one who survived and he was the one with the platform.
He did. If a desperate, wealthy assassin can successfully convince the entire global population for over a century that his victim was an indestructible, supernatural monster,
Right.
simply to sell memoirs, win lawsuits, cover up his own spectacular incompetence, and save his social reputation, it demands that we critically examine the historical narratives we accept as fact.
That is a chilling thought, because the movie monster is easy to digest. We like the binary narrative of a handsome prince slaying a demonic villain.
We really do.
But the reality that a complex, flawed, opportunistic human being was caught in the grinding gears of a failing autocracy in an international shadow war and was executed to protect the status quo that requires critical thinking.
It raises a vital, provocative question for you to consider today. As you navigate the modern landscape of sensational headlines, as you watch deeply polarized political figures being painted as either absolute demonic threats or flawless, untouchable saviors by various media ecosystems,
Right.
ask yourself, whose exaggerated myths are we currently accepting as absolute historical fact? Who is funding the narrative, and what incompetence or what systemic failure are they trying to hide?
That is the perfect question to leave you with, because as we've learned navigating the ice of the Neva River today, sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones climbing out of the freezing water. Sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones sitting in the gilded palaces writing the script. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.